Another session at Housing Washington. I'm Carrie Williams from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, who will give us a session on addressing the racial wealth gap and building community wealth. I'll introduce you now to Sarah McKinley, who is the Director of European Programs at the Democracy Collaborative. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thanks for having me here, and to the whole team. I'm really just impressed by this event. So many people gathering live online. It's a real wonderful opportunity, and it seems like quite an impressive lineup and a really full next few days. So it's a true honor to be contributing and to be in dialogue with all of you and the good work that you do. So greetings from one West Coast to another. I'm calling in from the West Coast of Scotland, where I'm working with partners to develop models of shared ownership of assets in place. So assets including land and housing. But before I get into that, a bit about my organization, the Democracy Collaborative. We're a US-based think tank that works to advance models of economic democracy in places as diverse as Alameda County in California, Chicago, and yes, even North Ayrshire here in Scotland, which is what brings me here. We believe that true human flourishing requires that people have control of their own economic futures in addition to their social conditions. We believe that democracy cannot reside only in the political realm through an increasingly non-representative electoral system and the results that we are seeing from that now. But that democracy must also reside within our economy. We must democratize our economy as well as our polity. And we can do this through changing who owns and controls productive assets in place, so that wealth is not extracted out of our communities, but recirculates within it. A thriving local economy requires local ownership, so that the economic advantages of the wealth created from those productive assets are spread broadly and shared by those who create that wealth in the first place. These assets, such as land, housing, enterprises, labor, finance, and so forth, create wealth beyond just income, as you know too well in the work that you do. So to truly address the growing wealth inequality that we are seeing in our communities and in our countries, and in particular, the racial wealth gap, we must build wealth in our communities and not just individual or family wealth. Currently, just 3 men have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of all Americans put together. And while millions of Americans have lost their job, healthcare, and savings in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, the wealth of US billionaires has grown by $1.3 trillion. That's multiples of millions of dollars. They're in fact profiting from the gain of this moment of crisis. So to change this requires us to think differently about asset ownership, and particularly how conventional efforts to increase individual and family asset ownership intersect with new approaches around community and collective ownership of assets in place. Individual ownership forms have frankly proven insufficient in our current economic system, and particularly in this moment of crisis, which in fact is the beginning of a series of crises that we are moving into, the compounding crises of inequality, wealth inequality, racial extraction, and fossilized fossil fuel extractive economic development. So we must develop plural ownership forms across a spectrum of assets, resources, enterprise, and services. The good news is we already are doing this, and we can continue to do it at greater scale. Community wealth building is a term that my organization, the Democracy Collaborative, first articulated in the mid-2000s. And it's an effort, it's a collection of efforts and strategies that work to produce broadly shared economic prosperity through reconfiguring local institutions and local economies on the basis of greater democratic ownership, participation, and control. Community wealth building is a new way of thinking about economic development, poverty alleviation, and wealth creation and accumulation. There's a broad spectrum of democratic ownership forms, many of which you are already likely familiar with: cooperative enterprises, community-owned banks, community land trusts, housing cooperatives, municipal utilities, and so forth. These community wealth building institutions and approaches extend community ownership and control over economic assets while also helping individuals and families grow wealth. So let's dig in, for example, to one example that I know you're familiar with, community land trusts. And in fact, I'm sure most of you know more about community land trusts than I do, but just looking at it broadly as a frame, community land trusts ensure community stewardship and control of land through a nonprofit holding company. In 2019, a study showed that community land trusts significantly contribute to family wealth creation, and particularly in families of color, thereby offering a huge potential to narrow the racial wealth gap. However, the shared ownership structure of community land trusts provide a transformative reality to ensure community control that allows these trusts to preserve affordability of housing over the long term and mitigate against displacement and real estate speculation that destabilizes communities and erodes resilience. So this is just one example of one community wealth building strategy. Imagine if there were multiple such community wealth building strategies at play in a single community that were linked up and connected in a concerted strategy. One of the most robust examples of a community wealth building approach in the United States is that of the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. Located largely in a low-income, predominantly Black neighborhood on the city's east side. Evergreen is a network of green employee-owned cooperatives integrated into the supply chains of local public and nonprofit anchor institutions. The cooperatives currently employ over 200 worker owners, all of whom receive a living wage and the opportunity to share in a percentage of the profits of these cooperatively owned enterprises. With ownership comes multiple benefits that increase the wealth of the individual owners and their families, including, in fact, a profit sharing and home ownership program that has helped many members that work in the cooperatives purchase homes and stay in the community. But what distinguishes this model is that it is designed to benefit not only the individuals who work in the cooperative, but also the community as a whole. The cooperatives are networked together by a community-controlled holding company that gives local stakeholders a say in whether the cooperatives can be sold or moved out of the community. This holding company entity also receives a percentage of profits from each cooperative that then provides a fund to scale the network, building additional enterprises to serve the community. In 2018, Evergreen launched the Fund for Employee Ownership, which acquires local firms that may be struggling or potentially closing or may have a leadership transition and convert them to employee ownership, bringing them into this supportive network and creating more shares in the profits of this network. What the Evergreen cooperatives are doing is recirculatory. It multiplies and grows wealth locally for the people who create that wealth in the first place, while also supporting the well-being and stability of their community in order to reverse long-term economic decline. As America begins to build back better after COVID, and American Rescue Plan money from Congress begins to funnel new resources to communities, now is the time to scale these kinds of efforts, community wealth building, and to connect these efforts as a means of achieving a more just and fairly distributed economy. Doing so will build prosperity for the many and not just the few. And the good news is this is happening already in the United States, in your communities, and across the globe. Now is our opportunity to really connect these, scale them, resource them, and ensure that local economic system change is the basis for a recovery, not just from COVID, but to prepare for the crises ahead of us. So I just wanted to begin with a few introductory remarks about what I do, but I really want to open up the conversation to talk about how this relates to a lot of the work that you're doing in your communities, especially with regards to thinking about housing and affordability and wealth in many different ways. So I'd love to open up with a few questions. I also want to say that we just launched a book that was published by the Aspen Institute and the St. Louis Federal Reserve on wealth. It's called The Future of Wealth, and it talks about many different creative forms to build not only family and individual wealth, but also community wealth building. We have a chapter featuring in there, as do other thinkers in this space, including Mariano Mazzucato and others. And so I'm happy to share that link with you. Carrie may have already dropped it in the chat. and would like to open this up to dialogue and go from there. So thank you very much. And again, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to ask a few questions of my own while we wait for folks to really get in on the chat.
Great, thank you.
I'm wondering if you have examples. You mentioned the Evergreen Cooperatives and that example of sort of small businesses participating in this co-op. I'm wondering if you've heard of or have any examples of affordable, of multifamily dwellings. If there's an ownership model wherein folks who don't have upfront capital to invest in their own homes and perhaps don't prefer a single family home ownership style of living could in fact accumulate some kind of equity in their home.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of models. And of course, I mentioned the community land trust. And so while the land itself is held in trust, you can have individual owners of the properties on that land. The trust helps keep the land at a stable pricing so that it doesn't speculate, but the individuals who are living in the CLT can actually own their properties on that land and have equity in them. And then the trust really just keeps the sort of increase in turnover of the price when an owner sells within a certain band, but they can still gain equity within that. So that's one model. And of course, that looks different in many places. And that's a model that's been practiced across the US, starting actually in Burlington, Vermont, and which is the most famous example of it, but it's in many other places as well. Housing cooperatives is another good example where a cooperative of people living in a certain building come together and they own the building together, and then they sort of can have cooperative shares of the building itself in their while living and occupying individual units. There are many different models of that as well. And so those are two different sort of broadly held wealth strategies using housing. The other thing I'll say too, one of the things that we do in community wealth building is really looking at local economic actors in place. So often institutions, institutions like hospitals and universities, for example, city government, cultural institutions, place-based institutions that are actually also large employers and large purchasers of goods and services in place. And so we call those institutions anchor institutions, and we work with those institutions to really think about their economic impacts and how they can direct those to local communities, and particularly communities that have been sort of left out of traditional economic activity. For example, in the Evergreen case, the local hospitals purchase goods and services from the Evergreen cooperatives. One thing we're exploring, and we're seeing this more with partners in Europe, is thinking about housing development, affordable housing, public housing as anchor institutions at themselves. So these are institutional actors in place. Housing is a huge generator of economic activity from construction to supply chains and so forth. How can housing developers, and I speak of community CDC as community development corporations, and other affordable housing developers, as well as sort of public housing developers, think about that economic activity and how to shift it in a way that benefits residents, not only of those housing communities themselves, but of a wider community. So how to sort of upskill and train around construction techniques and the supply chain there too, and then how to create different forms of enterprises within that construction supply chain, but also property management, for example. How are we creating skills and rooting those skills and the wealth created from them in the communities we're trying to benefit as well. A really exciting example that we had the honor to be involved in is actually an Indian country on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is one of the poorest areas of the United States. It's a place where, if you can imagine it, the life expectancy for an adult male is 48 years, which is the lowest life expectancy in the Western hemisphere short of Haiti. And that's within the United States. And that, I mean, we shouldn't allow that kind of disparity to occur in the countries that's supposedly the wealthiest country in the history of human civilization, right? That it's maddening and insane. And yet there's so many assets in that community. Obviously, the Pine Ridge Reservation is a beautiful and spiritual and cultured place with human assets and other things, and land assets and other things. But how can the people living in that community actually benefit from and control those assets, especially when you're talking about a reservation where in fact the land itself is held by the federal government. But so we worked with a group called the Thunder Valley CDC. It's a community development corporation. They went through a whole integrated community-based participatory planning process where they engaged elders and young people and youth. And they went around and they talked to everybody in the community about how can we create our own economy? How can we root our own economy here? And over again, they heard from people they needed housing, they needed land, and they needed jobs. That's what they needed. And they didn't have access to any of that. So they pooled their resources and they started, along with support from foundations and other organizations, they started actually buying up parcels of land out of the federal trust holding land and created their own parcel of 33 acres of land that CDC now owns in trust itself, and they have built a whole regenerative community. And in so doing, to build this whole regenerative community rooted in indigenous values, rooted in indigenous building forms, they thought sort of traditionally what they would have done is gotten a construction company from Rapid City or some other or Denver or some other nearby city that had the skills and the knowledge and the engineering. But what they realized is that they were going to be creating so much economic activity in doing this, but they didn't just want to import that and then have it go away. They wanted to use that to then train their own youth in those skills and in that construction, to manage the land, to think about wastewater management in new and more sustainable ways. What would that look like if they were to do all of that and to create that kind of skill base in their own community? So they created an employee-owned construction company to build. And they did work in partnership with construction firms from Rapid or from Denver, but they had an apprenticeship program so that they could build up their own skills and then create a direct employment track into that construction company. And then there's a whole series of other employee-owned enterprises that are growing out of that one activity in and of itself. So it's a really interesting model of thinking about housing, not just as sort of an individual benefit, but as an economic generator itself, and how that can be distributed more broadly for a whole community.
That's exciting stuff. Thank you. I'm going to turn to a question in the chat now from Michael Syrath. Michael says, I lead an organization with 1,100 affordable apartments in Seattle, and these are tax credit units. Are there any good, elegant models for renters to build wealth or down payment funds while they're paying rent each month? This kind of maybe goes back to my question about building equity while you're in a rental model.
Yeah, and of course, I am going to preface that I am not an expert in these kinds of tax credits and these different structures. So I imagine
Understood.
I'm curious to see if there are ideas from the audience or Carrie, if you have some thinking yourself, because I am not an expert in these specific models, and I'm not an expert in housing either. I focus broadly on these institutional forms. So I'll preface it with that kind of transparency. But I also do think, as a housing developer that has, 1,100 units, I mean, there's a huge opportunity in that, and for the residents themselves, in addition to sort of the development organization, to think about also those units, again, as, if they have to be upgraded, right? They have to be retrofitted, they have to be greened, there are all these things that have to happen as part of that property, and how can that be done in in a just and sustainable way that's also building skills and then also building equity for not only the people living there, but then for the people who are working and servicing and creating those. So I know that there are many examples of very exciting sort of green retrofit within a cooperative housing model. And I wish I had done a little bit more research on the specifics before coming here. I apologize, but I know there are examples out there. We're working in Chicago, and there's a Pilsen housing cooperative on the southwest side in the largely Mexican and Latino neighborhood there that has done a really interesting green retrofit, upgrading an older building to repurpose it for modern and healthy and safe uses for people who wouldn't have access to that kind of housing that generally have poor housing conditions in those communities. So that's one example that I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are millions more. I know there's a lot of great work around this.
I'm really interested in this idea of housing as its own kind of economic engine, because we do have a lot of great affordable housing developers here in Washington that own a portfolio similar in size to the one that that Michael referenced. How can we open the conversation with these other kinds of funders that you've mentioned in terms of other anchor institutions such as hospitals and philanthropists in order to kind of get some of this activity going? Where's a good place to start?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not an easy answer because it's going to depend on your place. And I mean, what we always say, which I suppose is probably an insufficient or disappointing answer, is start with what you have. Start with where the open doors are. Start with, you know, what is available to you. I would posit that there's a really interesting moment right now. I mentioned the ARP funds that are going to be coming into communities. A lot of cities are getting lots of money from the recovery plan and don't necessarily know what to do with it. For example, we're working, I mentioned Chicago, and they're getting a lot of money through the ARP. And one of the things they're going to be doing with that is putting it into housing. But how can they make sure that that housing is not just, you know, a for-profit developer who's going to be building housing that really doesn't actually benefit people in most need who really need that kind of housing. So I think there's an opportunity to influence some of those things. I know that there are a lot of foundational actors who are thinking about this broadly, but I think it's a real moment of opportunity to influence sort of where some of that money goes and make sure that it's being used to really sort of change the thinking around how you do this work. Hospitals, well, I should say actually universities and city governments, for example, are also large landowners, as you likely know, and particularly city governments have a lot of land that is not in productive use, vacant land in need of remediation, things of that nature. And there's a huge opportunity to really think more creatively around what to do with land as an asset and how have that benefit a broader range of community actors rather than just, you know, the normal property rentier class that are actually benefiting from sort of land speculation and other things of that nature. So how to use that land or how to work with the city to get them to think of that land in broader terms, and how to do that in a way that promotes more affordable housing, more diverse housing stock, better green housing and things of that nature for a wider variety of people. So I think this is an opportunity moment where people are realizing that these assets can't just be sort of extracted in the same way that they have been in the past to benefit sort of a few rather than the communities, because we're having such sort of stark differentiation between sort of communities and people who have been extracting the wealth from our communities. And so really thinking differently about land and property within that, I think is this is an important moment to sort of press that not only on city government, but on local institutions as well. How are they using that land?
Great stuff. We've got a lot of questions coming in now. You mentioned that you're not an expert in housing, so I'm going to kind of skip the real housing specific ones. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about wondering if you have heard about the Tacoma Anchor Institutions Network here in Washington. Unites hospitals, the city, universities, and the Housing Authority. And wondering if you know of that model. If not, we can talk about other similar models that kind of maybe center around a place, but include various larger institutions as maybe part of not the collectives itself, but as supportive institutions that do similar things to the hospital that you mentioned in Cleveland.
Absolutely, and we actually have engaged in the past with that network in Tacoma, and in fact, we'll be reaching out to sort of re-engage, because I do think this is a really important moment. So yes, we're familiar with that network in Tacoma, Washington, and lift that up as an example. I just put in the chat, I don't know if everyone else can see it, but Carrie, hopefully you can share that with the broader group. A report that we recently put out. Well, we put it out a few years ago, but we revised it for this moment in sort of post-COVID recovery, if you will. Although I'm afraid we're not fully there yet, to use the term post, unfortunately. But we're getting there. That have a series of recommendations for how to think about community control of land and housing in this moment. So I just popped that in there, and I believe in that we talk about some of the examples coming across the country, including the Tacoma collaborative there. So definitely take a look at that. But and of course, lift up that example because and again, I do think this is a moment to get more resources to examples like that, and really lobby your local governments, your local authorities, both city and county and state, to be thinking about these kinds of models and strategies in place and scaling them.
Another model that's been brought up that I wonder if you could comment on is a mixed income neighborhood trust, MINT, a community directed entity that develops, owns, and operates rental housing and retail. Just wondering kind of if you've heard of it, if you have any reaction to that, and if not, maybe it's an idea we can all look into.
No, I don't know that model specifically, although I do actually think that it's really important when we're talking about land as an asset, not just to think of housing, but also real estate, and creating sort of community control of commercial assets as well, which I think are really important. And you can do that in cooperative enterprise forms, but you can also do it through real estate development and different things of that nature. So I don't know that example, but I will certainly look into it. I don't know this platform. I'd be curious if that person could speak more to that example and share it with some of the folks on the line. I'd certainly be curious to learn and know more. Is that a Seattle-based example?
It is not, I don't think. It's from Trust to Neighborhood. So I will transfer the site into your chat as well, so that you can take a look at it. Meanwhile, I have another question about, you've kind of already touched on the fact that these kinds of models can be used for all kinds of ownership, not just limited to residential, but how about the opportunity to create shared green and community garden type spaces? Can you talk to that for just a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is hugely important in terms of thinking about productive land use. I think so often in our current thinking about, economic development and creating or extracting wealth from assets, we think that we have to put sort of the highest generating asset, the highest generating productive use of that asset. And we so often think of that as commercial real estate or luxury housing or something like that, where we can generate the highest rents and fees as a result of that. So I would argue that that whole valuation needs to be questioned. Obviously, it hasn't been working, and thinking of productive use in more broad terms, including not only things like community gardens, but things like greening and rewilding. Where I am here in Scotland, one of the things that they're doing with brownfield land or land that was held privately and mismanaged is actually reclaiming that land publicly, and then giving the community the opportunity to actually buy out that asset. It's called an asset transfer, and they give the community actually an opportunity to argue what a productive use would be of that land for their community, and then to take that bit of land back into community control. And a lot of what they're arguing for actually here is rewilding, regreening. So taking that land back and not actually doing anything with it except for cleaning it and growing trees and green space and other things, particularly to deal with this sort of the climate collapse that we're in the midst of, and we'll be going into more. So you thinking about that kind of productive use of land beyond building, beyond growth. And again, what underpins all of this is questioning the need for economic growth, for its own ends. And really, what do we value, and how do we measure that? And of course, to continually just grow for profit at the expense of not only communities and our individual health, but of the planet itself. And I think we really need to be interrogating that at the deepest level. And so really thinking about land is integral to that. And it's a limited resource. And we need to be able to steward it in more appropriate and responsible ways. And so, yeah, thinking about greening, thinking about land stewardship, thinking about rewilding, and how we can do that, I think is really important in this moment.
So you've talked a lot about kind of the great benefits that can come from models like this. Can you address a little bit maybe some of the unintended consequences that you have observed in your research and experience? Questions maybe about sometimes mixed income, unintentionally creating some gentrification and displacement. Just wondering if you have anything to speak on there.
Well, that is certainly something that happens. And that's sort of why we argue that actually the ownership of the land and the governance of the land. So when we talk about, for example, a community land trust, what's really important is what is the governance structure? Who's on that, right? If it's a collectively held trust, but the board is made up of developers or speculators or, somebody who's looking to extract profit, then it almost doesn't matter. It really, the governance and who's on that, community residents, community organizations, representatives from local services, the city government, people who have vested interests in actually the community itself and the health of the people and the land and the planet they're in. So really focusing on governance, I think, is really important for ensuring that even the best intended efforts don't end up with this sort of speculative pricing out, which certainly does happen. I would say it's interesting. I mentioned a few times that we've been working in Chicago, and we've worked largely in African-American communities in Cleveland as well. And then this goes back to the question of growth. We talk about growth for growth's sake being a bad thing, but there are certain sectors of the economy and there are certain communities that have been left out of growth, and so they haven't received the benefits of sort of the economic growth that sort of the industrialist class or the 1% have. And so the question is how why should they be cut out of the benefits and opportunity of that kind of growth? And so I know, for example, a lot of communities of color they want to be able to benefit from home ownership, individual home ownership, for example. and other forms of wealth creation that so many of us have benefited from. So why should they, be expected to hold things collectively in a way that they might not be able to profit as much for that? And I think that's something we need to grapple with. I think that's a really important question, that why have some people been able to benefit from this model, and those who haven't are now being expected or asked to behave more magnanimously than the rest of us have. I mean, that is something we need to grapple with as a community, and confront and have some really difficult conversations with. So when we talk about community wealth building, we talk about it as being pre-distributive, meaning we are working to create new forms of ownership, new institutional forms that distribute wealth more effectively, more evenly, more equally by their mere functioning. What we see a lot of times through taxation and other things like that is redistributive. I would argue that in order to actually have a fair playing field for us to pre-distribute, for us to create these new collective forms, we will have to have substantive redistribution of wealth, so that those who have benefited from our current economic system actually have to share that wealth, that profit, that benefit with those who have been deliberately cut out of our economic system. So we need to be able to have those kinds of reparative, if you will, I mean, dare I say, reparations style models, in order to really have a level playing field to talk about these things, these pre-distributive collective ownership forms. And so that's something that we are not talking about. And I would posit that we need, if we want these new forms of collective ownership that we all should be participating in, to be sort of where we're headed in the future, we need to repair the damage of the extractive economy that have benefited some at the expense of a vast majority of people. And those people are mainly Black and brown people. So I would say I wouldn't say that's unintended. In fact, I think it's quite intended by the way our system is currently structured, but I think we need to be explicit in thinking about that as we move forward to a new way of sharing our wealth and living together.
Wow. I'm not sure everyone listening and watching expected quite what we got in this session. I didn't expect this much. We got much more than I think we signed up for in terms of a discussion about wealth building and wealth sort of regenerative economies and the way that we can affect not only our communities but our planet. We are heading close to our session end, and I wonder if you could just give us kind of an optimistic view of where you see this heading, and signs of people paying attention to that kind of conversation that maybe we're not having in this country as much as we should, but you work in Europe, and there's that kind of direction, and then there's also kind of conversations with Indigenous communities who've always prized and cared for our land resources. Kind of either one of those to wrap up, I think would be great.
Yeah, well, and first let me thank you all, because I've gotten so much out of this. Carrie did share with me some of the links of examples here, and I will be sure to capture that, because I mean, there's so much learning to be had from the work you're doing. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm very one-sided here, and I didn't mean to be on a soapbox, because I think your knowledge is rooted in real practical implementation, and you're the expert. So I appreciate the ability to be there. I think it's a very challenging moment in human history, and there's a lot of ways to be pessimistic about it. And yet I am incredibly hopeful, because there are examples of this kind of work and change and not going back to business as usual all over the place. I do think this moment of crisis, again, that we're sort of moving into compounding crises, but this moment of crisis has pulled back the veil. It has shown us that the way we've been doing business heretofore is not working for the vast majority of people. And it's also shown us that there are people and places all over the planet experimenting and doing work in creative and exciting and just and sustainable ways. The work that we've done in the US was based on work that happened in in Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain. That was based on work that has happened in places like Tanzania, in Ujamaa collectivism. So these are all growing out of our collective efforts, and there are examples all over the place. And it's time to scale them and make it not the fringe, but the real way that we live together as humans on this planet. So I'm hopeful.
So many
I think
people
we don't have a choice.
So many people just echoing what you've said and thanking you for the great trove of information that we've gotten in this session. So again, I just want to give you a hand, and thanks everyone for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thanks to the organizers. Well done.
You all done, ladies? Thank you very much.